Levi-Strauss was fairly well known for saying something very interesting about this sort of approach. By that I mean the summary of his work. And he said that if you can't quickly sum up what it is that your life's work is about, what it is that you work on, then you're probably not doing anything very important. In other words, if it's not something that you can distill into relatively simple terms, then you're working on something that is very specific. And if you're working on something that is very specific and very technical in a very niche sort of field, then it's probably not something that's very important by his account. Now, I think this is kind of an amusing comment and certainly something that's worthy of reflection, whether he's right or not. But nevertheless, this is at least representative of his attitude, and I think what we see is precisely this. He is summarizing his major ideas and reflecting on them in a very broad and general fashion. So, there's a lot of utility in that, and certainly for us trying to get an introduction to his works, I think it's really very useful. Toward the beginning, one of the things that we read is that myths are inspired, and specifically they are inspired and not intentionally created. And we're going to encounter this division again later when we talk about Blumenberg and metaphor, because that's the criterion for him that differentiates myth and metaphor, and that is that one is intentionally created, consciously created, and the other is not. So myth being created more like art or dream, and metaphor being an artifact, something that we create. For a specific purpose, presumably with a specific intention in mind. So, we encounter the same sort of thing in Levi-Strauss. Now, this is not a throwaway idea or distinction. It's really a very strong claim that what we find in myth is in fact not consciously created. And this is worth dwelling upon because it's not obvious, and one of the reasons, perhaps, that it's not obvious. Levi-Strauss, for instance, discusses several things that have replaced, partially at least, the function of myth in modern society. Now, he mentions, and this is towards the end of the book, history, the novel, and music. So, effectively, we have history and different forms of art. And it's interesting that it's described in this way, that it is taking over part of the function of myth, that this is something that in modern society we digest differently and are inclined to do different things with. So, whether myth is something that is inspired, if it's something that is consciously created, or perhaps a blend of both, we're going to return to this question, and in particular with the Jungians, and Campbell has a particularly acute account of this, we're going to encounter this idea again, because we see a fair amount of evidence for myth not being something that is always consciously created. There seems to be something that we're just naturally inclined to tell the same kinds of stories. And that's interesting. And this is something that Levi-Strauss is going to pick up on. Now, Levi-Strauss is a structuralist. And I think what this means is really elucidated very well by the story that he tells of how he got involved in anthropology and patterns and anthropology and then religion in particular in his own lifetime. And the way that he describes it is through the kinship and marriage rules. And what he said was that he likes order and that he was always frustrated by irrationality, which is a wonderfully quirky sort of comment to make. But at the same time, this is not an unnatural thing, that we do indeed like order, and we are unsettled by what is unfamiliar. If something is really random, then it's going to seem a little frightful, a little weird to us. So what he saw in the marriage rules, who could marry who, when it was done, how it was done, all of the different rules associated with these things, and kinship likewise, who was, the important relation, who had this task and the other, and what do you call your, mother's brother's son and your whatever. These things seem somewhat arbitrary, but even though they seem arbitrary, they're the same patterns that you see over and over again. So if it were arbitrary, one would expect it to be more random than it is. And this is what's interesting, and I think this is really a very worthwhile thing to point out. And he tells this in terms of the story of the south wind and the skate. And the myth sounds just like all the other myths that we're accustomed to hearing, probably nothing all that terribly unusual, and that's really the idea here. But he asks the question, why the south wind? Why the skate? Why should we think of things in these terms? And later he describes twins and hair lips being associated with one another and asks the obvious question, why should this be the case? Why should twins have something to do with the, abnormalities in the weather and that sort of thing? The fact that we see it once, we might think, oh, well, okay, myth, whatever, they're just making this up, it's random. But when you see the same thing over and over again, and you see the same kind of content being used in the same way in very different societies, then we either have to say, well, there's diffusion going on where these guys, these cultures must have had some contact with one another and sharing ideas, or if that's just simply not tenable, which in many cases it's not, then we have to admit that there is a pattern, and that there is a pattern that is worthy of explanation. It's worthy of consideration. And this ultimately is what led Levi-Strauss down the road of structuralism. And so what he's looking for are invariants, universals, things that do not vary from one culture to the next. And so while a lot of the superficial details obviously are going to vary, is there something in the way that certain themes are used, or better yet, and this is really where structuralism gets its name, the structure of the myth, the form of the myth? Is there something in the form of the myth that we can expect different cultures to have in common? And can we use this then to explain why it is that certain images and ideas of animals and people and events and whatnot are used instead of others, and why it is that they are used consistently? And so what Levi-Strauss is trying to do, and I do think it's important to remember that he wants to make a science of this. In other words, he wants to expand the role of empirical science to include qualitative phenomena and to include things like patterns in religion and patterns in anthropology. Anthropology is a discipline which is forever plagued by having a subject where things they're never truly isolatable. They're things that you can never put into a kind of laboratory experiment. When you're doing ethnology, it's very difficult to isolate particular pieces of culture to try and really understand what function they serve, exactly how we should understand and explain these things. We really get these masses of cultural information all at once. And they're things that we get all at once. It's a totality that we have to consider, not just in the details, but that it has meaning as a totality. And this is really where things get either frustrating if you're wanting to make an empirical science out of it, or intriguing in that the approach by empirical science that we are accustomed to taking is fundamentally incompatible with the data that we have. In other words, anthropology is simply not amenable to the traditional kind of empirical scientific approach that one might like for it to be. And that makes it very interesting because we certainly have these patterns. We certainly have something that is important and worthy of explanation in terms of the varieties of cultural phenomena. But it's not obvious at all how it is that we should understand these things and how it is that we can make any kind of science, and Levi-Strauss is going to say an objective science of the history of religions, of patterns in comparative religion and patterns generally in anthropology. So his work on structuralism is an attempt to make a science out of these things. For better or worse, he is bent toward trying to make it that way. Now, one can easily argue, I think, and people have, and we'll talk about these kinds of objections more as we discuss Levi-Strauss in the context of 20th century comparative religion and anthropology later in the semester. But one could easily argue that not all of the qualitative, what it's like, and the important qualitative information is captured by the structuralist approach, which still seeks to slice and dice things. It just does so in a more interesting and maybe clever fashion than what we see by, traditional catalog of, let's say, superficial details, and, wherever we see great floods and wherever we see, what have you. So there's certainly something of that there. Now, I want to use this and this push for the inclusion of the qualitative to also inform the next topic. And that is Levi-Strauss's comment that traditional societies want to, in the fastest way possible, get to and maintain a total perspective. And what is meant by total here is, as he says, if you don't understand everything, then you don't explain anything. Now, this is, as he points out, very much the opposite of the scientific approach, where we tend to valorize uncertainty. In other words, we value the uncertainty that we have, and we like to know where it is and say, okay, there is this stuff that we still don't quite understand, but that's okay, because that's a problem that we're working on. This kind of gap would never be admissible in a traditional society. And even though, as Levi-Strauss is going to be wont to say, justifiably or not, that the traditional explanations of the world, their perspective on the world, is illusory, so fundamentally they don't know what it is that they claim to know. That's what he's going to claim. Nevertheless, they seek to maintain this total perspective. Now, what this means is that there is not space for the kind of inquiry that we're accustomed to with science. There is not space for the uncertainty, the unknown, in the same way. So the world is very much familiar and known. Now, this does something very specific for us psychologically. We like the familiar. We're good with the familiar. The unfamiliar and the unknown tend to be uncomfortable to us. And the unfamiliar and the unknown, if it is inextirpable, in other words, if there's nothing that you can do to get rid of it, then it's not hard to see how that can create something of a neurotic condition, to use more psychoanalytic terms. And that's interesting, I think. Because if it is in fact the case that the unknown leads necessarily to anxiety, and perhaps neurosis, but at least to some kind of anxiety, then we might go back to what Mircea Eliade was saying with the terror of history, and say with him that there is something fundamentally incompatible with that kind of worldview and psychological health. Now, again, this is what Eliade is going to say, and Levi-Strauss is at least going to give a nod to why it is that the traditional societies did have psychological health, not in mind in the sense that it was designed, but at least it was compatible with our psychological well-being to think that we understand things. It is in our advantage, it is to our advantage to believe that we do understand the world, and that the world is familiar, the workings of it, our place in it, and so on and so on. Not understanding this, correspondingly, would be uncomfortable, anxiety-provoking, and potentially a very serious problem. And this is something that, as I said, Eliade recognizes, Levi-Strauss certainly gives a nod to, but doesn't take it as far as Eliade does. So Levi-Strauss is going to be more concerned with making a science of the study of comparative mythology, comparative religion, anthropological details, whereas Eliade seems to be more attuned to trying to understand it in terms of psychological impact and import to the individual.